let me introduce our panel. I said already, Sharon Herrickfeld has agreed to join us. Lisa Biergard, the director of the North Dakota Division of Juvenile Justice, will follow. Terry Williams, Deputy Secretary of the Kansas Department of Corrections. And then we will move on to Clinton Lacey, Director at the DC Department of Youth Services. So again, they're going to take about 5 to 7 minutes to share some of their initial thoughts. And Sharon is the newbie to the group. You drew the short straw, and you get to go first.
You know, this really isn't fair. This really isn't fair.
We can flip it.
Late last night,
Okay.
I said I would do this, but I'll start since everyone else has had much more time to prepare than I have. So if I start, then the bar is set so low that everybody else will do so much better.
I like the way Sharon works. Get that bar really low. We're going to give you a standing ovation when you're done.
So one of the things that I've known about leading strategically is that you have to start with really why you're there. You know, what is your passion? Why are you in the position that you're at? And so early on in juvenile justice, as I was talking to someone that I thought was a mentor, they said, just always believe in why you're there and keep your integrity. So when you're talking to individuals, don't change your story based on what you think they want to hear. And I can tell you, in a state like Idaho that's very independent-minded and extremely conservative, working with kids' issues, keeping your passion and maintaining your integrity is really important. And we're a small state, large geographically, but small when it comes to population. So relationships are really important, and you have to keep those relationships, and you have to maintain those relationships. And so when we talk key stakeholders, Shay talked a lot about crossover youth and key stakeholders. In Idaho, key stakeholders include county commissioners. It includes the city councilman, because when you're talking prevention, you're talking all the way through. All the way through, we're very close with our judiciary and with our Department of Correction. As a matter of fact, our public information officer is also the Department of Correction public information officer, just so that there's clear understanding of that. Early in juvenile justice, I looked at the importance of getting early childhood, because as the person said, I don't deal with 6-year-olds, mine are older. What we know is those 6-year-olds become the kids that are in our system, and what we can do at 6 will maybe change the trajectory of them getting into our system. The bipartisanship, I am a Democrat, little left to the Democrats in Idaho, in a very conservative Republican administration. And I think that the reason that I was able to do that, again, was because I kept true to why I was in this field and what needed to be done for kids. And when I talked with the governor, I said, you need to know I'm a Democrat, so as you're looking at the direction you want to go, you just need to understand where I stand. And he said, I understand that, Sharon, and I want the person that will do what's right for kids. So I'm hiring you. And so, again, that integrity. I didn't change what my values were. I didn't change the direction I wanted to go. I kept moving forward. And so, to me, the system approach that Shay talked about earlier is really important, so that you know who your child welfare people are, who, you know, because, again, the kid that's abused at 5 is the young person that's in your system at 15. It's the same individual, and so what can we do to address their needs? And Shay talked about the comp strategy, and we worked a lot with the comp strategy early on when it first came out. And truly, the comprehensive strategy was addressing the developmental approach before the science was talking about the developmental approach. and working with our communities. When we would go to communities and talk about, let's start prevention programs, and with the funding from OJJDP for the Title V prevention programming, I had one community that had 2 applications that came in for a Title V program and didn't even look at the applications. I denied them both. And I said, if you guys can't talk to each other in the community, you have no right developing a comprehensive prevention plan. It made both programs really angry at me. And so what they decided is that they were going to develop a program regardless of what I did. They came back the next year with such a strong program, and they said, we don't care if we get it the next year because we're all together. That's the part that I think when you're leading strategically, if you stay true to what it is that you need to do and stay true to the kids that we're serving and their families and their communities, that it helps the communities get ready for the young people that are leaving our system and going back to them. It helps the families understand what kind of management skills that they need to have, and it helps the young people understand that there are people that have care and concern about them and their future.
Thank you, Sharon. You raised the bar. It's a really good job. Okay, Lisa, you're on.
Okay. So Sharon, I think, when you talk about knowing who you are, that's certainly something we focus a lot on in our CJCA leadership training. And I think that's just a great place for us to start is you leading off with saying that we need to know who we are. The notes that I prepared really, I think, kind of build off of that in terms of also being able to analyze what resources you have at your disposal at the time that you can use and leverage. In the system that I lead, I followed a highly effective, well-respected leader. And so he had spent a great deal of time building and inventing a case management system, which really was the backbone of our system. But I knew that there were things that need to happen in the facility and facility life that needed some serious reformation. And so it was finding that way to say, but we need to work over here without impugning any of the work that had been done before. So that was a little bit of I had to be careful as that was opening. I relied heavily, because I hadn't spent a lot of time in facilities, I didn't have much background, I relied heavily on CJCA at that point and on the best practice days that we have at our semi-annual meetings, because I've never found one of those to ever disappoint. Those are just such profound training opportunities for us. I also really came to care for the CJCA meetings as a time away from my agency where you could really take in what we hear at these meetings and apply it when you go home. It's really a sort of a breakaway where it's safe and you're with other leaders who you can talk in ways here that you can't really do at home because it's not as safe. The other thing that I think is so important about CJCA are the peers. I've never left a meeting where I don't have just all kinds of notes on things that other directors say. So it's such a learning from each other. And for me, that's been sort of the heart of the strategy. Take in everything you can, network with the people around you, and know that the best practice that comes from CJCA is you can take it to the bank. It's good stuff, and you're not going to go wrong if you follow it. Our facility life in North Dakota was fairly traditional corrections, I would say, a fairly typical environment. We heavily relied on isolation. There was some fairly fixed responses to infractions. There was a lot of emphasis on order and on compliance. And I knew we need to move away from some of those policies and practices, but I just wasn't quite sure where to start. We were a PBS state, so we started with the data that we had on isolation and restraint. And I thought that would be a critical place to make some inroads. We wrote facility improvement plans and and we showed everybody our facility improvement plans, and we gathered more data, and it got worse. And so by about 2009, I had realized that, just using my performance-based standards was that we were doing something wrong, and we really needed to connect staff to the idea of what we were doing. So we developed a strategic planning process that really involved everyone. And after we really worked hard for about 6 months on our strategic plan and engaged all of the staff in that process, they were finally able to make some strides forward where they started to really engage in what they were doing. So it took a while, I think, to get the momentum to push through that first big reform. But where I want to go with this is what I noticed after that, and that's that once the staff had achieved a couple of big wins, it was easier to get their minds focused on other reforms. But what I noticed is they were still waiting for me to tell them what that should be. That we had lowered resistance, we had gotten them interested in data, that they were able to say, okay, we can change some things, and we can actually do it pretty well, and we can do it safely, and that feels good. But they couldn't identify what to do next. And I don't want to leave an organization that can't continue to move itself forward. So, see, I wrote all these notes now so I could keep myself on track, because I didn't want to just try to, because I was afraid I'd miss something, and now I can't keep up with my own notes. So they need to be able to be adaptive and responsive to whatever comes next, because if there's one thing that seems to be true in juvenile justice in the last few years, is that all of a sudden, as we have access to so much more knowledge and information and research, we're called on to change more quickly and adapt more quickly in ways that we never had to before. And so I really want them to feel like they're not dependent on me as a leader when I move out of the way. And so really that has been sort of the strategy that I've been involved with in the last couple of years. Now, I've been the director in North Dakota for 10 years. So I'm not sure if you have to be there a while in order to really start realizing, peeling away those layers of strategy and leadership to try to get down into some of the weeds with this, or if it's something that you could know about going in and knowing you're only going to be there for a couple of years. If I thought that I was going to have a very short shelf life, I think knowing that you can strategically begin to teach others to become a learning organization so that your mission can carry forward, so that your truth of who you are as a leader can become someone else's, and they can carry it forward even after you're gone, probably might be helpful. So I started really looking around at what did we have that we could use to help move ourselves towards a more learning organization kind of perspective. And we've really relied heavily, again, on the performance-based standards data cycle, because that really gives us the opportunity. You collect the data, you analyze the data, you make a plan, and then you go back and you look at it again and you tweak your plan, or you choose a new plan, so you move forward with goals and you set new goals. And it's a more dynamic sort of way of leading strategically than those 5-year strategic plans that we used to write. But what we found is that when we get into that data analysis, as people got more sophisticated with using the PBS tools, we didn't have to just survey around the items, for example, that are in the PBS conditions of confinement. We were able to gather data on other aspects of who we are and what we were doing. And that really, I think, has excited a passion in some of the administrators and some of the mid-level managers that has allowed them to sort of develop that Socratic curiosity where instead of them trying to reach a benchmark in the data, they're able to be curious about the data and what happens when I do this, and they're getting a lot more experimental and creative. And I'm really hoping that what that's creating in them is an ability to move themselves forward once I reach my rule, which I already did. So now, you know, one of the nice things about getting this much gray hair is that if they want to, you know, you're no longer dependent on the system. You can kind of do what you want, because what are they going to do? Fire me, right? So that was, when I tried to think about what would be helpful for this discussion, I wanted to talk about that what you leave behind in terms of other people's ability to carry forward what you start. So those, I guess, are my thoughts.
Thanks, Lisa. Terry?
Right, so I wish I could tell you that I have this beautifully leather-bound, multi-year, detailed plan for my agency that outlines every objective and every goal with data for the next 3 years. But I think the truth is that really very few of us have that sort of level of detail and roadmap for our work. And though most of us are accustomed to building the airplane and flying it at the same time, that most of us are dealing with crises of the day, and frankly, as Shay mentioned earlier, and I think the amount is about 2.5 years, we simply won't even have the tenure, most of us, to see even a 3-year strategic plan come to life. At the last session, I know a lot of us in the Midwest were really kind of drooling over Christie's research department, because many of our research departments, that I use in quotes, are maybe 2 or 3 people for both juvenile and adult services, and really what they're relegated to doing is just running simple reports every day. As budgets have eroded, you know, that's just what has happened in many states, mine included. But I, like most of you, feel a really great responsibility, as I've heard the 2 previous speakers mention, to leave the agency better than where we came to. So we just can't shrug our shoulders and say, well, gosh, okay, we just can't possibly do anything, because too many kids and families rely on us to be the voice to propel the work forward. So while we don't have this comprehensive plan, what we've done is really develop some short-term leadership action plans and strategies. So unlike Lisa, I did not come to an agency that was very stable. It had periods of stability, but my first leadership plan or action plan was really already laid out for me, because when I came to my role about 5 years ago, we were facing a scathing legislative post-audit pertaining to one of our juvenile correctional facilities, rightly criticizing virtually every level of the work, from lack of training to poor hiring practices to not supervising kids appropriately, having unclear policies, and having programs that were not consistently applied or frankly not available for kids. So, and that's not unlike some folks come to their role in that, and I know part of CJCA is finding those like situations and having some comfort and camaraderie and support in that. But what that does is provide an opportunity to take advantage of those crises, because when crises happen, suddenly folks are interested in solutions. At least that's what I found. So really what we did was try to shamelessly capitalize on that, you know, in a systemic way. And we did that, tackling that work, and really having a very high level of transparency and communication with our stakeholders about our plan of action and the progress that we were making. I made written reports every month for over a year, to not just the legislative post-audit, which was a requirement, but I sent those public documents to all of our community stakeholders just to let them know, this is what we're working on. We recognize that these are problems. And I think that was really instrumental in helping our agency regain some credibility. It also became an opportunity to capitalize and advocate for an improved system, not just at the juvenile correctional facilities, but in the community too. So beyond that, again, we sort of shamelessly asked and took advantage of every outside resource that was available that we could get. Certainly, as Lisa mentioned, CJCA helped elevate our knowledge of best practices and provided some free training for our staffs and webinars that some hadn't had exposure to in the past. We were a PBS state, and those 5 years ago, you're welcome. We used to help lower the field average at that facility. You know, the work that you know, we were really just kind of going through the motions. I'm sure Kim is too kind to nod her head, but you know, the action plans or the improvement plans were just kind of you know, and really getting some people invested in that work to dig deeper and find out what's the root cause of why these numbers are what they are, and how can we, not just in the short term for the next cycle, because we knew we weren't going to make those huge gains right away, but what are the long-term strategies to help things like officer safety and kids feeling more safe. So, of course, we were also very fortunate that Annie E. Casey was invested in Kansas through the JDAI work. We did also a study of our out-of-home placements. That was one thing that was glaring outside the JCF, was that Kansas's rate of out-of-home placement was, I think, 6th in the country at one point, 6th highest, right? Not exactly the place you want to be. And so we had done a study for the legislature about that, and also developed provider advisory groups, because at the time, really little information was required from those providers. They had 500 plus kids in their custody every day, and our state did little more than ask, how much do we owe you? So establishing some performance outcomes for them and some accountability to say we expect more than just that, I think helped their buy-in, but I think also then the study demonstrated and prevented some of the pushback that that would later happen with the legislative reform. So beyond Annie Casey and PBS and CJCA, through CJCA, we were connected with the Council of State Governments in the Reducing Recidivism and Improving Outcomes for Kids. And that strategy was really to clean up our own sandbox before we looked beyond our own work. So looking at the policies and practices and getting our house in order was really important. And again, a leadership plan developed and an action plan around all of those, I think it was 33 recommendations. What was helpful about that is that that report had really echoed many of the same messages that we had been given to our legislature. So, you know, sometimes having an outside agency to bolster the message that you're giving gives them some confidence, right? That, you know, you're heading down the right path. So I think that that was really helpful as well. You know, then, as I've previously admitted, we sort of stalked Pew for about 2 years, and they finally relented or selected us to be one of their states for technical assistance, and help us then look at the greater picture of our statutes. So part of what they added to that mix is an ability to mine the data, some of our data that in a way that we previously hadn't been able to do, and also connect. We're a trifurcated system in Kansas, and so looking at court services, which is the judicial branch probation, our community corrections, and then DCF as well, and looking at that data. And lo and behold, some of that same messaging, right? Again, through the work group that was established, and that was helpful as well. So in messaging to the legislature, one of the things that I think is really important for folks in our work, we're lucky in that I think juvenile justice is really a bipartisan sort of topic, and there's a lot of interest in that right now. What I found is really trying to figure out which one of 3 groups I think most legislators fit in. you have a group that really are connected to the issues because they see it as an emotional topic. They really want to help kids, they want to help families, they want to make the world a better place, promote love and all of those things. There's the logical group of legislators who really want to know what's the data say, what's best practice, how can you translate that into action? And then there's frankly a group that really are interested in it because it's cheaper to do things on the front end than on the deep end. So I think as a strategy, we've also worked to figure out how to provide information in a way that's meaningful for each of those three groups. So now I think we have lots of people and lots of champions beyond just our office. And of course, those champions sometimes can say things that we can't, so that's helpful. And we've also gotten additional outside assistance through OJJDP as the sixth right on JJ State. So we're excited about the upcoming year and how that can help guide the work and the oversight council that has been established so that it will hold all the grown-ups accountable for a better juvenile justice system and some safeguards, again, with the eroding budgets, with statutorily required reinvestment of the monies that are saved. So we're excited about that. So I guess I'm just would say that, if you don't have the resources or the research departments that are incredibly robust, you just got to eat the elephant one bite at a time and pick two or even maybe sometimes one topic that is really most pressing and begin an action plan to solve it and then rinse and repeat. And I would just say lastly, developing the bench is super important for the tenure issue, and it never hurts to have multiple people giving that elevator speech to people. And while I think being a force to be reckoned with and an advocate is really important, I guess I'll also add that I think that, what's the adage, that a lot can get accomplished if you're not concerned with who gets credit. So.
Great. Thank you, Terry. Clint.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all of the previous speakers. A lot of what was said really resonates with some of what I wanted to talk about. Just a few of the highlights that just really hit me were the value piece about sticking to your values, and really intrigued by the idea of a learning organization. Like, what does that mean? How do you really turn that in your organization or help your organization grow into one that's sort of learning and growing and developing and evolving and not just sort of processing what is, right? And connecting the dots, of course, as was shared. And so I really wanted to just talk about some of the strategies that we've employed at DYRS in Washington, D.C. In preparing for this, I was reminded by a conversation that we used to have when I was at New York City probation a few years ago. And there we would have the conversation, the rhetorical it was, our budget was $90 million. And frankly, most of it was salary. There wasn't much in the way of program money. But still, the commissioner then, Vinny Schiraldi, who was previously in the position I'm in now, used to raise the question amongst the executive staff. So $90 million, right? If somebody gave you $90 million to throw at this issue of delinquency and criminality, what would you do with it? So to just step back for a moment, and imagine, okay, I got $90 million. How can I attack this issue? Would you do it this way? Would you set it up and structure it this way? And of course, that was, I think, a healthy exercise. The reality is, of course, that we're all very busy and trying to maintain some control and leadership and advance our organizations and just kind of keep the train on the tracks. And so it's sort of hard to step back to have these imaginary conversations, but I think it's a healthy one. And clearly all of us, and varying levels, have inherited organizations with quite entrenched bureaucracy. And so, it's a machine, right? And so it's not something that can or necessarily should be just totally uprooted and done away with. But I think a really healthy conversation is to think about, imagine what could your system be? And so we have that conversation here in Washington, and we're trying to do that as we continue to grapple with our day-to-day challenges, all that have been discussed. And I find myself, as a director, It's a real fight. You have to really be resilient, I find, and intentional about staying aspirational and looking at a larger vision, because it's so easy just to get pulled in to what is, just to try to maintain it. I was telling my staff, I went around speaking to the different staff. We have 500 staff, and I've been sort of guilty of it. I said I can spend 12 hours a day in my office just trying to keep up. But I'm just consciously making the decision that I'm going to spend time outside of that office at the 2 facilities, in the community, on the different floors of our buildings, just engaging with people to try to foster these conversations and figure out what is it that we're doing that is really advancing our work. And so I just wanted to share that for a bit of context. The field itself, and I certainly walked into DYRS and have entered into a field that has evolved, that has grown. I think it's fair to say, and definitely true amongst the people in the room and the leaders here who are doing great work, that we're moving away from the punishment, deficit-based, large institutional model and embracing and moving towards, strength-based work, youth development, smaller, less restrictive settings to the extent that we're able to do it. But in terms of really moving the field and the organization, I think that the next step is the next frontier, which there are certainly examples around the room and around the country of it, is really looking at community engagement and what I would call community reliance in a different way. Really seeing the community and the places where our young people come from, even those most challenges, as the source of solutions and as the target where we can and should be investing our resources to build their capacity. That we can't do our work in isolation without real, vibrant, effective relationships with community. And so for us to achieve that goal of DYRS in terms of strategy of moving the ball forward, we're really engaging in organizational culture change. We're really focusing on our organization and on our staff as a foundation before we can really, we are building the car while driving it, and nothing stops, so we continue to work and operate and work with our young people and families. But the real foundation we're trying to build is our own organizational culture change and working with our staff. And so really redefining our role as a justice system, imagining what it could be. What could we do with our $100 million in Washington, D.C.? How can we really imagine and then actually construct something different? So the steps that we took specifically, strategically, to begin to do this was just starting to have focus groups with our staff, with the entire organization, a series of focus groups where we engaged in some active listening to get a sense of people's philosophy, their perspective, their challenges, the issues that they're facing a day in their lives, whether it's somebody working on the front lines in the secure facility, or whether it's a case manager in the community, or even somebody working in contracts and procurement, or what have you, really listening to staff. And then based on that, beginning to have a conversation. And what we did is we brought in a professional marketing, branding expert who spends much of her time traveling the country working with the sales forces, right? And at first I was like, well, we're not in sales. But in fact, she made it really clear to us that we are, in fact, if nothing else, we are salespeople. We're selling an idea to our young people and our families and our staff, and selling that idea, hoping that they will embrace that and move forward. And so we engaged in this process of branding. And it's been very fascinating and effective, because brand, as we've discussed in this process, is not a logo, right? It's not just a sign, but really an examination of our values. Who are you as an individual? Who are you as a unit, as a division? Who are we as an organization? What are our core values? What do we stand for? What is our brand? How do we want to be perceived? When someone sees DYRS, what does that convey? What value system? What does that actually communicate to them? And then how are we living out that brand on a daily basis? And this has been very effective, down to the individuals actually engaging in some real conversation about their values and their individual brand. And then how does that brand fit into the larger brand of DYRS? We followed up this branding process then with actual hands-on training, youth development training, restorative justice, motivational interviewing, and all the technologies that we're aware of. But laying those trainings and those skill sets on top of a foundation of adhering to the brand that we've agreed to the value system that we've agreed to. And all of this has really essentially been the prerequisite or the foundation for us to start to get into building better processes for serving our young people and our families. And so then we can start to grapple with the things that, Shay, you brought up in your conversation about the actual challenges that we face, about planning plans for our young people as they transition from facilities, and how do we get them back home, and can they go to that home? And when they do, why do they go in the front door and out the back door? And so what is it that we can do differently to solve those problems? And for us, the thing that we think we can do more of and do differently is to rely on community partners, and not just 501c3 nonprofits, but actually natural leaders in the community. So we've launched a program that we call the Credible Messenger Initiative, where we are engaging organizations to hire grassroots folks from the neighborhoods to be credible messengers to our young people and our families, parent-peer coaches, mentors, sponsors, advocates for our young people. Many of these folks themselves had previous experience in the system themselves, are in recovery, have overcome a series of challenges. But what's been critical to this is the branding, training piece with our staff, because now we have credible messengers coming into our locked facility. So now our frontline staff in there, they have to have a relationship with these people. What does that mean to an organization when you bring in people from the very neighborhood where the youth come from, where there's the most crime, where that person themselves may have been in the facility 20 years ago, or you know the family. So now our frontline staff in the facilities have to work with these folks. And so we're doing a lot of work with actually cross-training and retreats to change our identity to where we see the community and these folks coming in as our allies and our partners and as people who bring value to our work. Our case managers in the community, now they have credible messengers from the community on their team, people who can go knock on a door at 6 in the morning, can respond to a text or a phone call at 3 in the morning, can walk a kid to school every day of the week because they're not going, and do the types of things that no organization is ever going to be able to do on their own. But it's in order to create this new relationship with community, we have to do the groundwork inside with our staff so they're receptive to it, but not just receptive to it, where they see the community and these folks as valuable to our work, and then begin to really advance the work collectively. And so that's been our strategy, really thinking about what is our culture, what is our brand, what are our values, and how do we actually walk the walk of community engagement to really transform the way we're serving our young people and our families.
Great. So great ideas, great thoughts from all four of you. So it really sets the stage nicely for a conversation in the room. I'm going to start this with a question from here. If you can talk a little bit about, if you think about leading strategically, some of that is about how you make sure you have a leadership team around you that can help you accomplish your goals. And again, that's going to vary agency to agency. Sometimes you get appointed to a position and your team's there. Other times you get to build the team. So talk a little bit about that and the skills that you look for in building your team. Because I think that's a strategic decision at the beginning. Who do I need around me to effectuate the agenda that I hope to accomplish? So whoever wants to jump into that first.
I'll jump in since I have
okay.
the mic. I'll
Okay.
take advantage. I read a piece recently, I'll have to find it, and it was an actual paper written on emotional intelligence. And it was talking about, not just in juvenile justice, but across industries in this country. It was a business journal. And it was talking about the most valuable asset in leaders that CEOs are looking for, or even board of directors are looking for in a CEO, is emotional intelligence. That the intelligence and the skill set around and the competence around performing a task or doing a job is obviously important, but what they're looking for and what they're prioritizing over that, because those are things that can be learned, is emotional intelligence, the ability really to engage, to engage with people, to be strength-based, to navigate the terrain of different personalities, because as was said, it's about relationships. So that's the most important quality that I look for. Are people, do they have the ability to work with complex groups of people with different perspectives and with to navigate controversy in a way that manages it and helps to bring everybody up together with these tensions, many of which will never go away, that these leaders have that ability. So for me, that's been the most important thing. Okay. People.
Okay. Other folks on the agenda. And do we have 2 mics up there or just 1? Okay,
Oh,
good.
there's 2.
All right.
So I guess I'll just add that, I came into the organization, I had moved back to Kansas, and about 6 weeks, I'd taken the job for Deputy Secretary of Community and Field Services on the adult side after working for a private nonprofit for about 11 years. And about 8 weeks in, my boss, the Secretary of Corrections, said, well, the governor's office is needing a little help over at Juvenile Justice. Can you help? And I said, well, what does help mean? And he says, I don't even know. So found out, the next day that meant, oh, well, you're going to run the organization. So, and it was supposed to be a 6-week gig, right? So emerge, and 5 years later, here I am, and I'm glad to be. But I think, when you come into an organization in that fashion that's in chaos, you really don't know who you can trust, even on your own team. And so, luckily, the superintendent of the facility that I spoke of earlier had just recently been replaced, and my boss at the Secretary of Corrections had helped and knew that person for many years and had a lot of trust in him. So, asking a lot of questions, having a lot of communication about what your values are, and then you have to kind of trust your instincts, I think, at some level. Now, I did have kind of free rein to fix what needed to be fixed, because it needed to be fixed and it needed to be fixed quickly. So I did make some changes once those really kind of revealed themselves, and I think you have to be decisive and willing to do those, make those hard decisions. Part of what I look for is really creativity and some passion in the work and ownership in the work, and somebody who's committed to hard work, because that's certainly what it takes. And I think, I think Shay mentioned having a core team of about 8 people, but developing that core group of folks. And we look back on some of those times now and say, gosh, we were all pushing the rock, and that's what it felt like, uphill many days. And we all got tired of pushing the rock, but we didn't all get tired at the same time. So I think that's a key of having some trust and some shared ownership in the process. That's been really beneficial to us.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks, Terry. Lisa or Sharon, anything to add?
Say that I didn't have an organization in chaos. I had an organization who had been doing the same thing for a long time and firmly believed they were completely fine, and that there was nothing that really needed to change, and that I was just looking for something to fix that didn't need fixing. So as what I remember doing was really doing a lot of that messaging and sort of talking and raising questions and raising issues myself, and then just looking around to watch at who was able to get over their own resistance the most quickly. And so another way of saying that is creative, but those people who were able to hold 2 sort of paradigms in their head at the same time and kind of could see a different way of doing things. And, it wasn't necessarily the people who were in those administrative and management positions. A lot of times, several of the people who now are holding key leadership positions were frontline people or but it was really a matter of I really watched whose eyes started to light up first, and to see who thought they could get over. The best way I can say it is get over their own resistance, and because when you push a system and you start culture change, the system pushes back, and so you got to roll with that resistance, but then watch who's able to kind of get there the most quickly, because that they're the people who have the ability to see around corners.
So Lisa, before you hand the mic to Sharon, I want to ask a kind of a self-reflective question of you. When you thought about who to put on that team and how to identify those people, how much of that was in an ability to look at your own skill set and say, there's things I bring to this job that I know I'm good at, but outside of that kind of the energy, the look in the eye, there's certain skill sets I need on my immediate team that I'm not strong at. And is that part of how you help to identify those people?
Certainly, the people in the facility life knew I didn't know facilities. And so it was really important, particularly, that there be some people in the facility who were able to see that the standard way of operating. You know, one of the things about you have, in some ways, those terrible, terrible crises provide you with some opportunity, like you said. When you have an organization that is not necessarily doing the right things, but the outcomes aren't obviously bad, when things are fairly safe and very well controlled, and you know, it's harder to convince people that you need to let up here on this stuff. And so you do need credible messengers that their peers regard as credible, because I was not.
Okay, great. Thank you for sharing that, Lisa.
Really quick, in Idaho, we don't have a deputy director. And so what I have is a leadership team. And each one of those has strengths. One of the things that we did is we actually did a temperament test to figure out so that each of them could understand what their strengths are, what their weaknesses were, and how they could communicate with each other. That was really beneficial for them, because as there's some dissension between, we can talk about, well, it's because this is your temperament. And if you look at this is their temperament, it really has helped. The other thing that we do as a leadership team to strengthen and help each other learn is we do book clubs. We just finished emotional intelligence, and tested beforehand and tested afterwards. That was really important for people to understand where they were. And so the strength, I think, of any organization is the bench. And as Terry said, it's not who gets credit for it, it's whether it gets done. And so we've always worked as a team rather than one individual or even two getting the credit for it. And I think that's been helpful with it.
Yeah. I think as I talk to different leaders who have experienced this phenomena of getting this appointment or going through a process of selection and they get the job offer, when they arrive at their agency, this process of figuring out, okay, so who is in this leadership office with me, and what skills do they bring, and what baggage do they bring, and do I have the ability to do anything about it to begin with? And the fact that you actually administered some type of testing just to create more awareness between your team, I think is important. I think we bring strengths. I think one of my strengths is probably analyzing and coming up with solutions. But I think early in my career, I was not good at being a good listener with my staff. So I had to build that when I was down in Miami as a skill set in order to get better at it. But I also needed to think about who could I bring in my leadership team that was good at that the staff could relate to, so I was able to filter up the things I needed to hear, not having them fester down below. So who was the nurturing person on my staff? Who was the analytical person on my staff? Who was the inspirational person besides the role I wanted to play on my staff? I think is an important step as we think about what we do. Okay, I have another question, but I'm looking at you guys, so if you nod your head, if you raise your hand, if you wink at me, I don't know what that means. So, yeah.
Can I add one
please.
thing to that? The other thing that I think that has been really hard to get across is just because I'm the director doesn't mean that I have the answers. And so when I say something and they say, okay, we can go along with that. And earlier at the breakfast table, we were talking about the emperor has no clothes. And I use that term a lot with my leadership team. I said, do not let me be walking down the street and you guys not tell me whether or not this is right. Because the strength is all of us together. It's not just one person. I think you bring that out by just understanding what our weaknesses are and helping to build that team that can tell you what your weaknesses are and be honest about it and understand that there's a level of trust that you can do that.
Great. So I have another question that ties into that one. A very shy group here. Oh, no, we have a question. Great. The great state of New York. Okay.
This is for Clinton. I am aware of the credible messengers. New York has it, but they do it on the child welfare side, Children's Village. They're doing a similar program. I guess for me, in listening to all of you, we've been doing juvenile justice reform for 9 years now, and we feel like we've finally impacted on the culture. One of the things that we have developed is a statewide family partnership, and parents are on this group along with my aftercare staff, and the parents are actually getting paid, which I got a little backlash for, but I'm saying, well, they're actually putting a lot of time into these programs, and you have to be a parent that either has a youth in our system or had a youth in our system, so the youngsters out, in aftercare. And I guess for me, in developing strategy, it's within my system, we're okay, but it's the broader picture, and I think we talked about it earlier, Shay, and you brought it up with the public perception. It's really government. It's like, we're split. I would say from Albany on down, we're pretty progressive in our state, and that most of those people are for raise the age, which we're one of 2 states that hasn't passed it, by the way. I'm a little ashamed of that, but anyways, but the other side really believes in law and order and punishment. That's what it comes down to. So I guess for me, what I'm looking for today, and I know there's a group after this, is what are some strategies for government? I don't have a problem pushing back, because I can retire, by the way. That's, so if they want to say, you can go, there are options, right? Right, but it's how do you impact on folks that really feel like these kids need to be punished, and that, they've done some heinous things in our communities and all of that. And quite frankly, that's a very small percentage of my kids. The rest of those kids are not in that percentage. So I'm looking for that from other states. My name's Ines, and what have you done to, successfully impact on government when it comes to that? Because, within our programs, I think we have had an impact on the culture, and the culture has changed. But like everything else, it's a work in progress, right? And I just want to say one thing about the love term. I was in Washington for a trauma-informed conference for schools and girls of color, and that love word was being spread. I wonder if it's a difference in gender or whatever, but they were really talking about girls of color and how they're suspended 3 times more than maybe Latinas and white girls in the school system and what's happening and all of that. But they talked about the concept of love and helping girls to find healthier relationships and loving on these kids, because a lot of them have been so traumatized. So, I'm with you.
One of the things that was real helpful to me in appropriations, which of course is just one small piece of our interaction with government, but there was some significant pushback in terms of moving away from models that very clearly are engaged in punishment. And I used the Reforming Juvenile Justice text, the National Academy of Science work that really does a great job of explicating the notion of accountability, as accountability meaning equaling corrective action, not punishment, and really sort of asked questions back around what is your goal here? I'm happy, and what we discovered is we did have goal alignment. They wanted kids that didn't move into adult systems, and that's what I wanted, and so then I could make some headway into the notion of where accountability lies, what punishment really does. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but
no, it's not. I'll look it up. I mean, I think my thing to them is they are punished when you take a youngster out of their community and their home and you lock them up. That's the punishment. The rest of it is treatment and what you do with the family and the youth. But they don't seem to buy that.
So Clint and then Phyllis wants to jump in the conversation.
Yeah, that last part reminds me of the
It's on.
of the the old soft on crime, tough on crime thing, and that debate, which is sort of like a trap, because we all know it's about being smart and effective on crime and delinquency, and what the data tells us, what evidence-based practices tell us, what best practices tell us. But I think we know that, right? So the big question I think on the table, one of them is, how do we communicate that? how do we engage in that debate or in that conversation? In New York City, when we were at probation, we took about half of our workforce and to put them out of the courthouse buildings and put them into the local communities, the 7 communities where most of the people on probation came from and where most of the crime is committed. And as we went to those communities, it wasn't just to set up a probation shop out in the community, it was to set up a center that was going to engage community folks. But there was pushback from even, not just from the sort of tough on crime or more leaning right folks. It was local people in those neighborhoods, grandmothers and folks, right? Not in my backyard. And we were saying, we're not bringing folks to your neighborhood. They live here, right? They commit crime here, right? So, and we're not just coming here to surveil them. We're coming here to say, how do we collectively take another look at this? And we began to share some data, and it was funny. We said, you know, we go around the country speaking at conferences, sharing our data, but we don't share it in the communities where people live, you know? And so we started to share our data and say, here, look now, look at what we're doing, look what's working, here's where we're sort of struggling, but really kind of going grassroots with the conversation, we think was helpful in starting to turn the tide of local community folks supporting this work. You know, and we felt that if we could get local community folk to support it, that the elected officials would follow.
You know, one of the things that we did was to appoint public safety with a rehabilitative approach. And there's lots of statistics that talk about how the punitive interventions actually increase recidivism. That's really useful in helping politicians see that, because everybody wants public safety. So in all of our communications, everything we do, we try to show how that rehabilitative approach increases public safety. So everybody can get into, you know, with a rehabilitative approach, you really pay attention to education. If you get better educational outcomes, people get that piece. So.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I just want to go back to one of the points we talked about, leading strategically, and this may be almost a personal testimony, so to speak. But early on, as we talk about the tenure of those individuals in our positions, early on, one of the things, and I heard others talk about gaining trust, you know, early on in my tenure, I've actually heard, you know, some of the senior members of my staff literally say, well, we'll be here long after he's gone. Right? So we'll be here long after he's gone. So all of that touchy-feely stuff he's talking about, you know, it may be relevant, but it'll pass. And after he's gone, we'll still be doing what it is we've been charged to do. And I think what happens is that even when we don't know whether we'll be around to do a 3, 5, whatever year plan, the fact that we're not apprehensive about doing what's right. Right? So I'm not apprehensive about doing what's right, whether I'm here 12 months or 70, 80 months or whatever. But then trying to get that support and buy-in for those who are members of your senior staff. I'm not talking about some, you know, no disrespect, entry level, whatever, some of your senior staff. And the real problem that I seem to have is, you know, I'm the guru. You know, Nate is here, Tanya's here. I'm the guru for detention reform, but nobody wants to hear about what we should really be doing in the deeper end. Nobody wants to hear about what we really should be doing in secure care, and some of those same principles that are about, you know, right kids for the right reasons and community engagement and all of those things still works. So, and if you get the data from that and try to do similarly in the secure care settings, it will show you that it still works. But the correction side of New Jersey, you know, I have correctional officers who think they're literally cops, call themselves cops. Sometimes don't believe in that and are somewhat resistant, and the internal pushback becomes, you know, the vice, not worrying about the outside. So I'm great at engaging stakeholders in my community and, you know, other juvenile justice leaders and youth advocates and all. Sometimes the pushback is internally because of those who believe you'll be going long after, and they'll be there long after you're gone, and they want to continue to foster a culture that isn't really about rehabilitation and community engagement.
Thanks, John.
So one of the approaches that we've used in Washington that's worked quite well. I don't think it would work very well if we went out and say, you know, the reason we want to do this is because of the law. That wouldn't have worked very well. Even in a state who sells itself as being moderate or liberal, the reality is the approach that we've used is to have an economist to come in and study our program. That economist also looked at what programs work in terms of reducing crime. And essentially, we've got a good brand in the state because people think if you look at it from either a love perspective or just a business perspective, we're doing the right thing. And I think if you need to consider that, if you want to sell change, actually go in and get something that you know works, and actually sell it to the people that you're trying to bring over to your way. I mean, that's the approach that's actually worked in Washington.
Thank you, John. Please.
I just wanted to add to what Kevin had said because I've heard those same things, and the superintendent in that facility that I spoke of earlier did too. I think part of what helped is that he and I sent a consistent message to the staff, but really one of the strategies that we employed, and it had a lot to do with PBS, was find your biggest naysayers and say, well, you know what, you have so much tenure and so much experience, we want you to chair the committee on officer safety, and really making sure that there's like no escape of, you know, you're gonna be involved in this process, we want to hear your opinion, and that's genuine too, right? You know, again, you don't want to be the emperor who's wearing no clothes, but, you know, I think just really being tenacious about challenging that kind of, if it's misinformation, or involving them in the process just as much as you can. And when you've got, you know, it's kind of like when you cite programs in the community, you know, the best advocates for fighting NIMBY are folks who were once against you and then have been won over. So, you know, that's been a successful strategy that we've employed, is really getting some of those key people who frankly have a lot of influence and power, and regardless of what level they're in, really involved in the process. And you may not change them all, but, you know, when it works, it's really effective.
Sharon, did you want to jump in on that, or are you good? Okay. So I don't want to lose this point, because I think how you cultivate your strategy in this area is really essential. Whether you use a tool that allows you to create a grid of who these stakeholders are, how you engage them. But I think the workforce watches. You know, your workforce watches you and watches this interaction with your leadership and other players in the system to see if they have your back, to see if, you know, they are going to support you in a moment of crisis. I think for leaders who fail at this, they're the ones that tend to, and sometimes it's just unavoidable, get cut at the knees when something bad happens, and the higher leader just says, okay, we can't tolerate this, rather than you knowing, Clint, that those stakeholders are going to be calling the mayor or the governor or the county commissioner and saying, you know what, there was a horrible situation, the leader has indicated they're going to address it, but the basic premise of what the work they're doing is good, is strong. And I think when I'm thinking, Peter, about Massachusetts and child welfare, when Harry Spence was not kept as the child welfare director, this is my opinion, I think generally it was held, that he probably was one of the top 5 child welfare directors in the country. But the governor's office was inundated with pleas from the providers to let him go, because he had not cultivated that relationship with the provider community. Conversely, Sarah, in New York City, John Mattingly survived in a position there for much longer than he ever would have if he did not cultivate relationships with the provider community and the consumer community to say, yes, there was a child death, but this man is accountable for it, and he's willing to keep working with a good plan to do so. So I think how we do this has to be one of the key elements of us leading strategically. Okay, we've got 3 minutes left. This is the speed date round. You know, this is the lightning round. Okay, so it was mentioned about data, and someone said specifically how people are envious about Christy Daly and Wansley Walters before her and the data system they have in Florida. Tell us more about, and this could be you all on the panel or in the audience, how are you approaching this strategically as a leader to be able to use the data in a better way, to have it and then to use it in a better way based upon what you currently have in front of you and what you're trying to build. Now, I wish Nancy Dietz would be in the room, but Nancy probably participated in these conversations and went home and said, I need a strategy to build a research arm, to build a data arm. And she navigated with her cabinet secretary and governor in the appropriations process to basically flip out 3 positions. To instead of working with the Statistical Analysis Center interstate, she now has a team of researchers that can drive the data that she needs. So how are you approaching that? And then I'm going to open it up, and then I promise Fair Boards will close. Okay.
what our plan is to parlay some of those savings and the reinvestment requirements into beefing up some of our research and really analyzing the data, the analytics that I know Fairboards talks a lot about. So there's that approach. And then I think also using PBS to the extent that we're able to collect that data, and also we collect data monthly on things like batteries and things like that. And so when folks challenge and say, well, all of this hug-a-thug, reducing isolation, you don't care about our safety, you're able to really put forth the data that says, well, here's actually the assaults and all have gone down since we've employed this. And so having that consistent message and really making sure that not just your community, but your staff hear what those numbers are. Because if they don't hear it from you, they're going to make up a story that fits their agenda. So that's how we're starting.
Anyone else on the panel or in the audience who wants to share on this? Sharon.
Well, again, I'm with everyone else. PBS is critical to the start of where we begin our data, and anytime we share data, we share our PBS numbers, because I think it really does provide a conditions of confinement piece that is necessary. We also are doing analytics thanks to Fairboards and the Oregon model. We've used that to begin to do our own analytics and look at different typologies, just to give our staff additional information on the young people that are coming in. And we developed a dashboard on our website that looks at the data for all of our staff to be able to look at. It's not, it doesn't go outside of our staff, outside of our facility, our department, but it provides all of our staff with the benchmarks that are in our strategic plan, so any day they can go on our website and look at where we are with all of those benchmarks.
Great, thank you. Christina.
I just want to say I just changed positions. I've only been in my new position about 7 months, but when I got there, one of the first things I saw that was a real area that we needed to work on was developing a data and evaluation and research plan. So that is not something the culture had in place. So we as a leadership team came together and designed a process where we actually pulled together, it was time limited, we did this in 3 work sessions, pulled together all the different representatives in the different layers of the organization and the different work teams. And we had facilitated conversations and breakouts where we had them say and talk and think about what is important to us to help tell the story of what we're doing and for us to understand if we're doing it well. So in terms of moving a culture and getting buy-in, and it's great to have data, but if your staff doesn't understand the data and it's not being communicated back to them in a way that they can digest, it's meaningless. So we had some data things in place, but there was never that input from the staff and that communication and sharing back with the staff. So we did that in May and June, and then just last week we did a big presentation and an update on how we're moving. So we're doing that every quarter. We're at our staff meeting, we're sharing the progress and what we're collecting and how we're moving forward and getting their input. So I think, I'm right in the middle of that.
Great example. We are over time. Do you have a comment you'd like to make? And take 15 seconds to do so.
Just a quick comment. In Montana, we have one of the highest premiums for workman's comp insurance. So one of our initiatives we started about 5 years ago was to decrease the use of physical intervention before we even started looking at isolation. And bringing PBS in at the same time. And as a result, this last fiscal year, our workman's comp premiums decreased significantly because we were able to decrease our use of physical intervention, thus decreasing staff injuries. So that was another piece of data that helped support what we were doing.
Another good example. So I'm going to turn it over to Fairboards. Please join me in thanking the panel. As a plug for CJCA, I think a lot of the leadership ideas, the innovation, the skills you need are offered through various things that the organization does offer. I think for those things it doesn't offer, you need to really take the time to figure out how do I develop those skills beyond what I can get from CJCA, locally, training, speaking skills, things of that nature that I think help us be more effective. So again, thank you all very much.